Most fans and non-fans of baseball are familiar with the doping scandals of the early 2000s, with players like Mark McGwire and Barry Bonds breaking record after record, only to later be found guilty of using performance-enhancing drugs. To some, this came as a shock, but the practice of altering your state of mind at the professional level is nothing new. There are many reasons players and people in general use substances. Today, I'm going to talk about performance-enhancing substances in baseball. I'm going to include all substances on the list of performance-enhancing substances because that's what they all are. When a player walks onto the field with steroids, alcohol, cocaine, or sheep's testicles, that's right, sheep's testicles, in their bloodstream, they're attempting one of two things. Their goal is to either enhance their natural abilities to perform better or subdue anxiety or emotions, which again will ultimately enhance their performance, at least in their minds. I'll look at the history, explore some colorful stories, and finally have a little debate on what should be considered a performance-enhancing substance when considering what baseball is and what will make it better. You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball, where there are no loud noises, no jarring music, only nostalgic, thought-provoking, emotional stories about baseball. I'm Ben Orlando. Alcohol feels as connected to baseball as bats and gloves. In fact, players were downing mugs of ale and shots of whiskey long before they were covering their hands with any type of glove. And the relationship of fans and beer is just as old. This relationship was organic and growing as so many things did in the early days of the United States. So many things were new, without precedent. And so the only way to move forward was to stumble your way through. This was the case with gambling, and it continued to be the case with alcohol throughout the game's evolution. There's the story of Curt Welch, who played center field for the St. Louis Browns in the 1880s. Welch was known to hide a bottle of whiskey in the outfield grass. Between plays, he would covertly wander over, grab the bottle, and take sips, then return to his position. Although I'm not sure how covertly a man alone in a baseball outfield can do anything, let alone grab a bottle from the ground and drink from it. Then there was Pete Browning, who played for Louisville around the same time as Welch. Browning said of his drinking, quote, "I can't hit the ball until I hit the bottle," end quote. Once in 1887, Browning had gotten on base and was taking a long lead, meaning he was moving toward second base, preparing to steal. Except Browning never stole second base, because while he was taking his lead, he fell asleep, right there on the dirt. The second baseman walked over and tagged out the sleeping, drunk ball player for everyone to see. It wasn't just the players who were problems at this time, but the fans as well. Baseball was the Wild West, with few buffers between the stands and the field, the players and the fans. From author Roger Abrams, quote, "Spectators of early baseball games were not separated from the field of play. Lubricated by hard liquor, onlookers would run onto the field to object to an umpire's call. Some would even grab a bat and seek to aid their favorite club by participating in the game when the need arose," end quote. As was the case with gambling, league owners will tolerate a vice right up until the point that vice threatens the continued success and financial growth of baseball. As attendance fell due to alcohol-incited mayhem, National League owners agreed to ban alcohol sales at games. They also forbade teams from hosting games on Sunday. Well, the Cincinnati Reds considered both alcohol and Sunday games their bread and butter. They refused to stop selling beer or playing on Sundays. And in 1880, they were subsequently kicked out of the league. But the Cincinnati Reds were the first professional baseball team, and still one of the best teams in the country. When faced with banishment or creativity, the Reds got creative. They decided to start their own league where alcohol was allowed, where teams played games on Sunday, and where you could get tickets for half the cost of the National League. This new league would be called the American League, or American Association, formed in 1882. By 1891, the American League fell apart, but it had driven the National League to once again accept alcohol sales at the stadium. As a side note, the American League returned for good in 1901. But within baseball, drinking was still a huge issue, and owners and managers did what they could to rein in their players. In the late 1800s, it was a common practice for baseball teams to hire detectives to follow players to find out if they were drinking, or drinking too much. If discovered to be overindulging, players were fined, banned, and blacklisted. From a positive reinforcement mindset, systems were put in place for good behavior. Players received bonuses for abstaining. In 1889, there was something called the Brush Classification Plan, which calculated a player's salary according to athletic performance and, quote, habits, earnestness, and special qualifications, end quote. And one of these habits was staying sober. Needless to say, this system didn't last long, so owners and managers needed to be creative. In 1920, manager Tris Speaker of the Cleveland Indians had a problem with an alcoholic pitcher, Ray Caldwell. So Speaker came up with a system that went as follows, quote, after each game he pitches, Ray Caldwell must get drunk. He is not to report to the clubhouse the next day. The second day, he is to report to manager Speaker and run around the ballpark as many times as manager Speaker stipulates. The third day, he is to pitch batting practice, and the fourth day, he is to pitch in a championship game, end quote. Using this system, Ray Caldwell went 20-10 and won a game in the World Series. He was also known for being struck by lightning after pitching 8 2/3 innings. When Caldwell awoke from his unconsciousness, he refused to leave the game and recorded the last out and win. But because of Caldwell's reputation in drinking, his career soon ended. In 1915, journalist Hugh Fullerton conducted a study on baseball players and the effect alcohol had on their performance and careers. Fullerton collected data over many seasons, along with information on which players drank and how much they consumed. He discovered that when comparing drinkers to non-drinkers, the drinkers actually performed better early in their careers. But over time, the non-drinkers did better overall. Also, non-drinkers had better longevity on the field and off. Hearing of Fullerton's study today, you might think most of his findings sound obvious. I'm curious about the better performance of drinkers versus non-drinkers early in their career. I wonder if this has anything to do with calming the nerves, how hard it is to break into the major leagues, and how helpful in the beginning it might be to use some substance to settle you. In the history of professional baseball, there was no shortage of alcoholics. Grover Cleveland Alexander, one of the best pitchers of all time, was supposedly drunk when he came in during the 7th inning of Game 7 of the 1926 World Series. Alexander pitched against the New York Yankees, and this was the deciding game. The Cardinals were up 3-2, but the bases were full of Yankees with 2 outs. Alexander shut out the Yankees for the remaining innings, and the Cardinals won the World Series. Cardinals manager Rogers Hornsby said of Alexander, quote, I'd rather him pitch a crucial game for me drunk than anyone I've ever known sober. He was that good, end quote. In 1884, heavy drinker Charlie Sweeney struck out 19 batters, a record that stood for 102 years. But 2 years later, Sweeney, drunk, refused to get off the mound late in the game. The conflict between himself and the manager rose to such a level that Sweeney eventually quit and walked out of the ballpark. He was then fired and ejected from the league. Another one of Sweeney's claims to fame was giving up 7 home runs in a game, still a record. A few years later, Sweeney shot and killed a man in a drunken bar fight. He went to jail for 8 years and died at the age of 39. Then there's Ed Delahanty. To be a famous person in your time is one thing, but to transcend time requires one to reach a whole new level of fame. Considering Delahanty's crazy, impressive, and tragic story, it's surprising he didn't rise to the fame as other players of the day, like Honus Wagner. Delahanty began his professional career with the Philadelphia Phillies in 1888. And it's true major league players in the beginning days made nowhere near what they make today, but they still could make a living. Delahanty received $1,900 his first season, equivalent to around $60,000 today. From the start, Delahanty struggled with alcohol, missing a fair number of games in his first few seasons. But in 1893, he came alive, nearly winning the Triple Crown with a .368 average, 19 home runs, and 146 RBIs. The next season, he batted .407. Now, I'd like to put an asterisk here, because while Delahanty was clearly good, during the 1894 season when he batted .407, 3 of his teammates also batted .400, which is wacky considering the last major league player to hit over .400 was Ted Williams in 1941. That's 82 years ago. And just as a side note, I researched the rule changes in the late 1800s, as we've discussed in previous episodes. But pitchers in 1894 were no longer throwing underhand. Pitchers no longer needed 4 strikes for a strikeout. And hitters were no longer awarded a hit and a bump to their batting average if they drew a walk. And you still had the dirty, hard-to-see spitballs. So, if anyone has information on how hitters were doing so well in this dead ball era, please send it my way, and I can add an update to a later episode. But back to Ed Delahanty. Whatever was going on at the time, he seemed to have found his groove. He became one of the best players throughout the 1890s and into the turn of the century. And if salary is connected to status, Delahanty was the best player in the major leagues in 1902, when he received a yearly salary of $15,000. In 1902, $15,000 equals $500,000 in today's money. Think of the most famous baseball player today, and that was Ed Delahanty in 1902. But alcohol led to Delahanty's downfall and death. In 1903, just 1 year after his mammoth salary, Delahanty was on a train and heavily intoxicated, waving a straight razor and threatening passengers. He was kicked off the train and stumbled his way across the International Railway Bridge between Buffalo and Fort Erie. And what the bridge happened to pass over was Niagara Falls. Delahanty never reached the other side. Whether he fell or jumped, nobody knows, but his body washed over the falls and was found at the base 2 weeks later. Many of the stories passed down involve players performing miraculous feats while under the influence, like Grover Cleveland Alexander or David Wells with his drunken perfect game in 1998. The stories about players' poor drunken performances aren't passed down as much, or they're hidden. Take Mickey Mantle, who was known to be a heavy drinker within baseball, but not so much in the public realm during his career. Mantle admitted that drinking shortened his career. He said, quote, "Casey had said when I came up, this guy's going to be better than Joe DiMaggio and Babe Ruth. It didn't happen. I never fulfilled what my dad had wanted, and I should have. God gave me a great body to play with, and I didn't take care of it. And I blame a lot of it on alcohol." End quote. For a long time, the story was that Mickey Mantle's constant injuries and pain shortened his career. But in an interview years later, Mantle denied this. He said, quote, "Everybody tries to make the excuse that injuries shortened my career. Truth is, after I'd had a knee surgery, the doctor would give me rehab work to do, but I wouldn't do it. I'd be out drinking." End quote. Mantle talked about drinking every night on road trips with his teammate, Billy Martin. They had this game where they would climb out onto the ledge 20 floors up and visit other players' rooms. But often the lights were out in these other rooms, so they'd have to walk all the way around the building on this ledge, drunk, 20 floors up in the dark, to return to their rooms. After his career, Mantle continued to drink. In 1994, he needed a liver transplant and spent his last few years speaking out against the dangers of alcohol. In baseball, just like in life, there's a constant denial and enabling going on. Management and players covered for people like Mickey Mantle, and the media covered and lied. And it wasn't only the lie that players didn't drink. It was the lie that players drank, but it was fine. They were fine. And if they could drink and play baseball, anyone could drink and manage. And on the side of drinking and fans, how has that been holding up? Well, economics make it hard. Right now in Washington, D.C., where I live, a beer at National Stadium costs $15. And this is the norm across the country. Although at Coors Field in Colorado, as of a 2023 account in the Denver Post, you could get a beer for $3. But this is alcohol. What about other substances? If you like the show and crave more content, you can become a Patreon member, where you'll have access to additional audio episodes, video interviews, and other articles and images linked to the show. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. And since this is a one-man production, every bit of support helps. You can donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can add reviews on iTunes and Spotify. Okay, back to the show. When it comes to many of the substances used and overused in baseball, there's often a clear origin story for the drug. War. During the Civil War, doctors gave soldiers opium pills and morphine injections for a variety of conditions, like gunshot wounds, amputations, dysentery. Whatever the injury or sickness, these new opium-based drugs worked extremely well. And in a time of little scientific research, if something seemed to help, why would you stop using it? That was the problem. Many soldiers, and then the general population, did not want to stop using these wonder drugs. After the Civil War, 300,000 soldiers returned home, addicted to morphine. During the 19th century, it's estimated that as much as 5% of the U.S. population was addicted to these new opioids. In 1900, the U.S. population was 76 million people, so that's nearly 4 million people addicted to opioids. And when baseball began to gain in popularity, thousands of new players were experiencing the pain and injuries that came from a game played without equipment, without helmets or gloves or guidelines. It was a strange time in history when using helmets and wearing gloves were not acceptable, and yet taking morphine or laudanum was perfectly fine. After World War I, you have the common culprits: alcohol, nicotine, opium, and opium-based drugs like morphine and heroin. Cocaine, first extracted from the coca leaf in the mid-1800s, was used by the German army to keep its troops awake. But this drug didn't catch on in the United States or baseball until the second half of the 20th century. World War II and Vietnam helped to spread the use of amphetamines, and with amphetamines, we're now talking more about straight performance enhancement to get an edge, whether it's in battle, in life, or on the ball field. It's also a good reminder to know that when most drugs first appeared, they were accepted, if not heralded. Amphetamines were available without a prescription until the Drug Abuse Regulation and Control Act of 1970. Here's an excerpt from a review of an opium den in New York City, printed by a newspaper from the 1800s, the Daily Graphic. Quote, Those in the habit of coming here say that it has beneficial medicinal effect, and, if only inhaled in small quantities, animates the spirits and gives energy to the intellectual powers, at the same time imparting a languor to the body, leaving the mind free from nervous effects." End quote. Cocaine, of course, was the active ingredient in the original recipe for Coca-Cola, and in 1863, an Italian pharmacist created a drink that blended wine and cocaine. The drink was called Vin Mariani, and it was celebrated throughout the world. Even Pope Leo XIII drank and praised the drink. While some drugs like morphine, alcohol, cigarettes, and marijuana were used for personal reasons that overlapped into baseball, drugs like cocaine and amphetamines could fall in either the personal or performance-enhancing categories. Players use cocaine and amphetamines to stay sharp, to heighten the level of their existing athletic skills. In 1970, free-thinking pitcher Jim Bouton wrote a tell-all called Ball 4, where he outed baseball players for all their common vices. In the book, Bouton highlighted just how much players drank and used drugs, explaining that players down uppers or speed as a daily pregame ritual. Dock Ellis said 90% of players in the 70s used stimulants like Benzedrine and Dexamyl. Speaking of Dock Ellis, despite a 12-year pitching career from 1968 to 1980, accruing 1,136 strikeouts and 138 wins, and winning a World Series, Ellis is best known for his drug use on the field, and for good reason. Ellis said of his career, quote, "I was on drugs every time I took the field," end quote. And according to Michael Silver, quote, Ellis said that the scariest moment of his career was when he attempted to pitch while sober in a 1973 game. During pregame warm-ups, he could not recreate his pitching mechanics. Ellis went to his locker, took some amphetamines with coffee, and returned to pitch, end quote. Said Ellis, quote, "I went from liquor to marijuana, from marijuana to cocaine, to amphetamines and everything else," end quote. The culmination of Ellis's drug-induced career came on June 12, 1970, when Ellis, blitzed out on LSD, pitched a no-hitter against the Padres. A few days earlier, Ellis dropped a tab of acid and hung out with some friends. He woke the next day and dropped another tab of LSD, except a friend soon pointed out that it wasn't the next day, but 2 days later, and Ellis was scheduled to pitch that day, June 12th. According to journalist Brian Graham, quote, "Ellis's performance for the Pirates against San Diego was not exactly a pitching masterclass. Ellis recorded more walks, 8, than strikeouts, 6, hit another batsman, allowed 3 stolen bases, and was bailed out by highlight reel plays in the field," end quote. Said Ellis, who only remembered pieces of the game, quote, "I started having a crazy idea in the 4th inning that Richard Nixon was the home plate umpire. And once I thought I was pitching a baseball to Jimi Hendrix, who to me was holding a guitar and swinging it over the plate," end quote. Ellis said he couldn't see the hitters. There was just somebody on the right or somebody on the left. And a few times when a batter hit the ball, Ellis dove out of the way, even though the ball came nowhere near him. Still, he won the game 2-0 and earned his no-hitter. Ellis's reasoning for using drugs throughout his career was about the fear of failure and wanting to dull the edge of the possibility that he'd fail, which is extremely common at such a high level. And of course, this fits into the category of performance enhancing, if not taking drugs sends you into a panic attack where you can't play at all. To highlight the culture of baseball at the time, after the publication of his tell-all book, Jim Bouton was called in to see the commissioner of baseball, who scolded him for outing the baseball community, even though everything Bouton said was the truth. This was another example of denial, an effort to keep the idealistic view of baseball in place. And as long as the fantasy remained, and the ugly consequences were hidden, fans and children would continue to emulate their idols. In terms of straight-up performance-enhancing drugs in baseball, we can go all the way back to 1889, when physiologist Charles Brown Sicard created an elixir based on extracts from the testicles of a guinea pig and a dog. Sicard said that his elixir would, quote, build up the nervous force of ill patients by bolstering their strength and resistance, end quote. That same year, James Pud Galvin, near the end of his career, decided to try the elixir. In 1888, Galvin became baseball's first 300-game winner. Galvin got there by pitching a ridiculous number of games each year. Between 1883 and 1884, for instance, Galvin won 92 games and pitched 143 complete games in 2 seasons. To give you an idea of how insane this is, Roger Clemens, who pitched for 24 seasons from 1984 to 2007 and is known as one of the most durable pitchers ever, accumulated 118 complete games in 24 years. Pud Galvin pitched 143 complete games in 2 seasons. So yes, Galvin's arm was shot and he was looking for a miracle drug. He tried Sicard's elixir and pitched a 9-0 shutout, and also hit 2 deep drives for extra base hits. But in the long run, the elixir couldn't save Galvin, who played a few more years and then retired. And whatever the truth was regarding Sicard's elixir, buzz surrounding the drug dissipated. In 1894, allegations spread about the use of performance-enhancing drugs by some players in the Temple Cup, which was that era's equivalent of the World Series. The extract was called cerebrine and was derived from the brain of an ox. This drug was never studied in detail and was never banned, but there is an interesting paragraph from an article at the time regarding the incident. Quote, "From a small beginning, a tempest has arisen, which bids fair to end only when the question shall have been decided as to the rights of players in regard to utilizing scientific methods for adding to their dynamic value during the progress of ball games." End quote. So all the way back in 1894, the baseball community was beginning to discuss the implications of performance-enhancing drugs. Even players who were already considered the best of the best tried crazy things to get an edge. In 1925, Babe Ruth, at the height of his career, injected himself with sheep testicles to gain a performance edge. Instead, Ruth felt incredibly ill, and the Yankees covered him by claiming he'd come down with one of his famous belly aches. When we focus on actual steroids and their entrance into the game of baseball, we find one of the first accounts in 1961 involving Mickey Mantle. According to writer Zev Shafetz, during his home run race with Roger Maris, Mantle was bothered by an abscess and received several injections, which included steroids. Pitcher Tom House, who played in the 60s and 70s, said there were dozens of players using steroids, and that when a team lost, players would joke that they'd been out-milligrammed instead of beaten. The steroid epidemic occurred between the late 80s and early 2000s, and while dozens of players were ultimately implicated, only a handful to date have actually confessed to doping. But where's the line between legitimately training to make yourself a better athlete and cheating to gain a competitive advantage? What should be allowed and what should be banned? According to WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, a substance will be prohibited if it meets 2 of these 3 criteria. 1, it has the potential to enhance or enhances sport performance. 2, it represents an actual or potential health risk to the athlete. 3, it violates the spirit of sport. Okay. The second point makes obvious sense. Of course you'd want to ban substances or behaviors that represent a risk to the athlete. Or does this make sense? Julian Savulescu, a professor of practical ethics, pointed out that steroids and PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs, would be much safer if they were allowed and regulated which could deter the use of unregulated and untested substances. Of course, even with regulation and allowed substances, there's still the possibility that players would use banned and dangerous substances. Now, let's focus on the first point from the World Anti-Doping Agency. It has the potential to enhance sports performance. What's not listed in this definition, and which could be added, is the unfair advantage factor. That is, players choosing to use a substance might have an unfair advantage over someone who doesn't want to use the substance. When I talked with author Jason Turbo, he brought up a great point about where the real tension happens in the game. It's not the superstars who are confident in their abilities and keeping their jobs. It's those 3 or 4 spots on the roster up for grabs, and those marginal players who could go either way. And then you have the choice. Do I use PEDs or not use? And then there's that other guy in the bubble who does use, and he gets the job, and potentially millions of dollars. And I go back to the minor leagues where I'm making 40 or 50 grand a year. And when we're talking about things that can enhance performance, where do you draw the line? Protein, for example, is well known to aid in the building of muscle. You can eat eggs or beans, or you can ingest protein drinks and powders. But this is not illegal. How about caffeine? Specifically related to athletes, caffeine has been shown to improve focus, improve muscle performance through activation of the nervous system, and also help endurance by sparing muscle glycogen, which, when used up, can cause people to burn out. However, many studies show mixed results due to various factors, including genetics. People have different reactions and side effects. For instance, I can't drink caffeine after 10 a.m. Otherwise, I can't get to sleep at my normal time. But my friends can drink coffee into the evening and night and have no trouble sleeping. If we all played professional baseball, they might have an advantage with caffeine, and I wouldn't be able to take advantage of the same substance because of how my body reacts. But caffeine is not banned. However, it was banned by WADA until 2004. But the urinary tests couldn't distinguish between normal social use and athletic abuse of the substance, so the ban was lifted. Which, again, means there are players in the league who will gain an advantage because of their body's specific relationship with caffeine. There seem to be some of the same blurry lines with steroids in terms of appropriate medical use and recovery versus straight-up abuse and performance enhancement. But are these gray areas enough to lift the ban on certain substances? So that's rule number 1 and 2 from the World Anti-Doping Agency. What about rule number 3? It violates the spirit of sport. Now, on the surface, it might seem like a no-brainer. Baseball is a pure game. Kids playing with parents. Honesty, integrity, respect. Remember, the basis for the code, all these unwritten rules, is respect. And to use illegal or non-sanctioned performance-enhancing drugs is to create an unfair advantage, to cheat. At the same time, you have longtime great ball player and manager Rogers Hornsby, who said in 1961, quote, "I've been in pro baseball since 1914, and I've cheated or watched someone on my team cheat in practically every game," end quote. Former umpire Nestor Chilak said, quote, "Ball players will cheat under any circumstance if they can get away with it. That's why we're out there. Our job is to prevent it," end quote. Authors Daniel Levitt and Mark Armour wrote an entire book on this topic, titled Intentional Balk, Baseball's Thin Line Between Innovation and Cheating. And based on extensive research and quotes from ball players, managers, and umpires, Levitt and Armour came up with a doctrine to summarize the sentiment of participants in Major League Baseball. They called it the Hornsby Doctrine, which said, quote, "Baseball players and others within the game will and should find ways to bend and break the rules. It is the job of authorities to stop them," end quote. If you apply the Hornsby Doctrine to cheating with performance-enhancing drugs, does this mean that not cheating or trying to cheat would be the actual violation of Wada's third rule? That cheating actually fits the spirit of baseball? If this is the truth for everyone involved in a game, what does it mean when it contrasts with the views of everyone outside the game? 100 years ago, the wall between players and the public was 20 feet thick. Now it's transparent. And what happens on the outside is absolutely affecting what happens within Major League Baseball. And this will certainly begin to change what the spirit of baseball means on both sides. I've only presented some of the views, and there are plenty of more valid points on each side. I'd love to hear what you think about this topic, so please share your thoughts on Instagram at Midnight Library of Baseball. You can also go to my website, midnightlibraryofbaseball.com. You can go to Facebook or at the many platforms hosting a podcast. You can also send me an email at midnightlibraryofbaseball@gmail.com. And if you like the show, please leave a review on iTunes or wherever you listen. And feel free to donate on Podbean or at my website. The music is A Long Way by Sergei Pavkin at Pixabay. Good night.